Hey everyone, welcome back to Alexa Bliss TV. I'm Alexa, and today we're diving into something that's going to blow your mind. We're talking about a geopolitical earthquake that just happened between Canada and the United States, an $850 billion energy deal that completely fell apart, and what came next is even more shocking. We're watching the real-time collapse of American energy dominance in North America, and most people don't even realize it's happening. This isn't just about oil and gas, folks. This is about power, sovereignty, and what happens when a superpower starts negotiating from weakness instead of strength. If you want to understand how the balance of power in North America just fundamentally shifted, you're in the right place. And hey, if you find this analysis valuable, do me a huge favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me what you think about Canada's bold move. Trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to have some strong opinions. All right, let's get into it. So here's what went down in the last 48 hours that you probably didn't hear about in mainstream news. The United States proposed a massive North American energy integration agreement. We're talking $850 billion over 25 years. The deal would have locked in long-term access to Canadian oil, natural gas, and hydroelectric power at below-market rates. From Washington's perspective, this was a slam dunk. The U.S. faces growing energy security challenges, domestic production is plateauing, and global supply chains are increasingly unreliable. Canadian resources represent the cleanest, most accessible alternative to Middle Eastern and Venezuelan supplies. Energy independence, price stability, reduced exposure to hostile regimes. What's not to love, right? But here's the problem. This wasn't really an agreement between partners. It was a demand for subordination dressed up as economic cooperation. American negotiators walked in assuming that market access and investment capital would be enough to secure Canadian compliance. They walked out learning a very expensive lesson. When Canadian Finance Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada was rejecting the entire framework, he didn't deliver an angry denunciation. Instead, he provided what may have been the most devastating economic analysis any American administration has received from an allied leader in decades. And that analysis revealed just how fundamentally American officials have misunderstood both their own position and Canada's strategic capabilities. Carney's statement was remarkable for its clarity and restraint. Canada, he explained, was no longer interested in long-term energy commitments that treated Canadian resources as American strategic reserves. The era of below-market pricing for American energy security was over. If the United States wanted Canadian energy, it could compete for it in global markets like everyone else. But the real shock came in the details. Canada announced it was finalizing energy agreements with the European Union, Japan, and a consortium of Asian buyers that would absorb most of Canada's exportable production for the next 15 years. Let me say that again. Not only was American preferential access disappearing, American access itself was about to become conditional on whatever capacity remained after more reliable partners were satisfied. This is where the story moves from trade policy to geopolitics. What Canada accomplished was a complete inversion of the energy leverage that has shaped North American relations for decades. You don't pivot $850 billion worth of energy commitments overnight unless you've been building the infrastructure, relationships, and institutional capacity to do exactly that for years. And that's exactly what Canada did while American policymakers were distracted by short-term political theater. The European Union's energy security strategy, developed after the Ukraine crisis exposed their vulnerability to Russian supply manipulation, has been quietly focused on diversifying sources. Canadian energy fits perfectly. Political stability, regulatory predictability, and geographic diversity that few other suppliers can match. Asian buyers like Japan and South Korea have been seeking alternatives to Middle Eastern suppliers for similar reasons. While American energy policy was focused on extraction and political posturing, Canada was building the kind of long-term relationships that create sustainable competitive advantages. And those relationships just matured into alternatives that make American pressure irrelevant. Now, Trump's response to this strategic reversal has been everything you'd expect from an administration that confuses volume with authority. The initial reaction was predictable bluster, trade wars, tariffs, economic retaliation. But when Canadian officials calmly pointed out that American energy infrastructure is more dependent on Canadian inputs than Canadian energy exports are dependent on American buyers, the tone changed real quick. What followed was a series of increasingly desperate attempts to reconstruct the deal. And the concessions that Trump's team put on the table revealed just how completely they misunderstood the balance of power. First counteroffer: American willingness to pay market rates for Canadian energy. From Canada's perspective, this wasn't a concession. It was an admission that the original demand had been economically unjustifiable from the beginning. Second counteroffer: American commitments to environmental and labor standards. Again, not meaningful to Canada, which already maintains higher standards. It was just an acknowledgement that American regulatory frameworks are inadequate. But the third counteroffer crossed into territory I never thought I'd see an American administration explore. Trump's team offered to negotiate shared sovereignty over certain border infrastructure projects, effectively giving Canada co-management authority over American energy facilities. Let me repeat that because it's crucial to understand what just happened. The United States offered to share sovereign control over American infrastructure in order to secure preferential access to Canadian resources. That's not negotiation, folks. That's capitulation. And Canada's response was even more devastating. They didn't reject the sovereignty-sharing proposal outright. They simply noted that such arrangements would require the kind of long-term institutional stability and predictable governance that Canada could no longer expect from American political institutions. Translation: America has become too unreliable to be trusted with shared sovereignty. The strategic implications of this energy realignment extend far beyond North American relations. When the world's largest energy consumer loses preferential access to the resources of its most reliable neighbor, global energy markets notice immediately. Oil futures, natural gas contracts, renewable energy investments, all shifted within hours of Carney's announcement. More importantly, other resource-rich countries began reassessing their own relationships with the United States. If Canada could successfully resist American energy demands, what did that mean for American access to critical minerals, agricultural products, and other strategic resources? The answer is becoming clear in real time. Norway has quietly begun renegotiating its energy agreements with American companies, insisting on current market conditions rather than historical relationships. Australia has started prioritizing Asian buyers for its liquefied natural gas exports, even when American buyers offer competitive prices. These aren't hostile actions. They're rational responses to the demonstration that American market power is no longer sufficient to guarantee preferential access. When your closest ally can say no and make it stick, everyone else starts wondering whether they've been undervaluing their own leverage. This is the demonstration effect in action. Middle powers and resource exporters around the world just learned that American economic pressure can be resisted if you have viable alternatives and the institutional competence to execute the pivot. That lesson is going to reshape global resource markets for decades. For American consumers and businesses, the consequences of this strategic reversal will be felt long before most people understand what caused them. Energy costs that have been artificially suppressed by preferential Canadian pricing are about to reflect actual market conditions. Industrial operations that depend on cheap Canadian electricity are facing cost structures that may no longer support profitable operation. The regional impacts will be particularly severe in northern states that built their economic development strategies around access to Canadian energy. New York's commitment to clean energy depends heavily on Canadian hydroelectric imports. Michigan's automotive industry relies on integrated supply chains that assume seamless cross-border energy flows. When those flows become subject to global market pricing and political uncertainty, the competitive advantages that attracted investment to those regions begin to disappear. Jobs that seemed secure become vulnerable. Communities that planned their futures around energy-intensive industries face transitions they never anticipated. This is what happens when economic policy is driven by political theater rather than strategic planning. And here's the kicker. The domestic political consequences will be felt most acutely in regions that voted most heavily for the administration that created the problem. Rural areas dependent on cheap Canadian electricity will face cost increases that threaten their economic viability. Industrial regions built around energy-intensive production will discover their cost structures no longer work when Canadian energy is priced at global market rates. The national security implications are equally troubling. American military installations along the northern border rely heavily on Canadian electricity and heating fuel. When those relationships become commercial negotiations rather than strategic partnerships, American defense planning faces new constraints. What makes this moment historically significant is that it represents the first time since World War II that Canada has successfully resisted comprehensive American economic pressure and emerged stronger rather than weaker. And here's why that matters. Canada's success wasn't the result of superior resources or military capability. It was the result of superior planning, superior diplomacy, and superior understanding of how modern energy markets actually function. Canadian officials spent years building the institutional relationships and infrastructure connections that made this energy pivot possible. They understood that effective resistance to American pressure required viable alternatives, not just rhetorical defiance. Mark Carney's background as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England gives him exactly the kind of institutional credibility and international relationships necessary to execute this kind of strategic realignment. When he speaks to European energy officials or Asian finance ministers, he's not just representing Canadian interests, he's representing Canadian competence. American officials, by contrast, approach this negotiation with assumptions rather than analysis. They assumed American market size would ensure Canadian compliance. They assumed Canadian alternatives were inadequate or non-existent. Every single one of those assumptions proved wrong. When your intelligence community can't accurately assess the strategic capabilities of your closest ally, what does that suggest about your ability to navigate relationships with actual competitors or adversaries? When your trade negotiators offer sovereignty sharing as an incentive to partners trying to reduce their exposure to your political instability, what does that suggest about institutional competence? Here's the deeper problem that goes beyond this specific negotiation or even this administration's approach to energy policy. What we're seeing is the systematic erosion of American soft power that once made preferential relationships possible without coercion. For decades, countries chose to provide preferential access to American markets and consumers, not just because of American economic size, but because of American institutional reliability. Partners could plan long-term investments around the assumption that American policy would remain broadly consistent across electoral cycles. That assumption has been systematically destroyed by an approach to governance that treats international agreements as temporary arrangements subject to unilateral revision whenever political priorities change. When partners can't rely on American commitments, they stop making commitments to America. Canada's energy pivot represents the maturation of that dynamic. This wasn't a sudden decision driven by bilateral tensions. It was the culmination of years of quiet planning for a world where American reliability could no longer be assumed. History rarely announces the end of an era with dramatic flourishes. More often, it shifts quietly through thousands of individual decisions that compound over time until the old order no longer functions and the new order has already emerged. Canada's energy pivot may be one of those quiet shifts that historians will later identify as the moment when American resource dominance in North America became a negotiated privilege rather than an assumed right. When your closest ally can restructure continental energy markets without your permission, and your response is to offer territorial concessions, you're no longer the hegemon you once were. You're a declining power, learning to negotiate from weakness while pretending to negotiate from strength. So there you have it, folks, the complete breakdown of how Canada just fundamentally restructured North American energy relationships and left the United States scrambling with desperate counter-offers that included actual sovereignty concessions. This is a geopolitical earthquake, and the aftershocks are going to reshape global energy markets for decades to come. The tragedy is that this outcome was entirely avoidable. American energy security didn't require preferential access at below market prices. It required competent policy, reliable partnerships based on mutual respect, and institutional stability. Instead, we got short-term thinking combined with political volatility, creating exactly the kind of uncertainty that forces rational partners to seek alternatives. The path back to effective energy diplomacy won't come through louder demands or more creative threats. It will come through rebuilding the institutional competence that makes American partnership attractive rather than simply unavoidable. Whether American political culture can sustain that kind of patient, competent work remains to be seen. But until it can, expect more moments like this one, where American assumptions about influence meet global realities about alternatives. What do you think about all this? Is Canada making the right move, or is this going to backfire? Do you think the US can rebuild its energy diplomacy, or are we watching the permanent decline of American resource dominance? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Seriously, drop your take on this because this is the kind of story that's going to define the next decade of North American relations. And if you got value from this deep dive, do me a solid and subscribe to Alexa Bliss TV. We're cutting through the noise and bringing you the analysis that actually matters. I'll see you in the next one. This is Alexa, signing off.